Bioethics 2.0 Podcast, Episode 3, Introduction to Clinical Ethics. This is Podcast Episode 3. The topic is Introduction to Clinical Ethics. You can find this information in Introduction to Clinical Ethics by Fletcher, and it is in the preface in Chapter 1. This information can additionally be found in Schroeder's Practical Ethics for Nurses and Nursing Students, Chapter 26. What is clinical ethics?
When distinguishing clinical ethics from all of bioethics, it's important to make a crucial distinction. Clinical ethics is the ethics of clinical practice and ethical problems that result in the care of patients, whether that be in a hospital, a nursing home, rehabilitation center, home care, or hospice. Essentially, what this means is ethics at the bedside, whereas bioethics as a field involves the systematic reflection of ethical issues and problems in healthcare, research, public health, and the environment. Clinical ethics should be seen as a bridge between theoretical bioethics and ethics at the bedside. Ideas can move both ways over this bridge, not merely from the theorist to practitioners, but also practitioners can help inform the theories. Clinical ethics builds upon the ethical obligation of clinicians and requires practical deliberation and action when ethical problems arise in the care of patients. The key thing to remember here is that unlike bioethics, which largely takes place in public debates and scholarly journals at conferences, clinical ethics requires decisions to be made quickly and appropriately at the bedside.
Clinical ethics methodology.
There are a variety of clinical ethics methodologies that have been introduced in the bioethics and clinical ethics literature. The case method for moral problem solving in these podcasts is the clinical pragmatism framework. We have a specific episode of our podcast that deals with the clinical pragmatism framework, and if you're interested in finding out more about this framework and why it is useful, please be sure to check out that podcast. Clinicians need knowledge and skills in clinical ethics to care competently for patients. It should be part of their basic skills in learning in medical and nursing school, and reflection on the four ethical obligations that apply in all cases should be as much a part of the workup of the patient as any other clinical test or step in the diagnostic process. Informed clinicians are society's main human resource for clinical ethics. Ethics at the bedside requires trained clinicians who have had ethics courses, who have participated in continuing education conferences, and know the four main ethical obligations and how to engage in ethical decision-making. The ethics services that exist to serve decision-makers, such as clinicians, patients, and surrogates, can be a good resource, but when clinicians either can't access them or they don't exist, clinicians should be aware that they are the main source for good clinical ethical decision-making.
Clinical ethics in the healthcare organization context.
The culture of particular healthcare organizations can be supportive, dismissive, or even hostile to clinical ethics. It's important to note that in order to operate an ethics service effectively, there has to be institutional support, enough budget for continuing education, and knowledgeable clinicians who can help solve ethical difficulties with the support of their colleagues. In particular, regarding nurses, there have been some instances where their involvement in ethics services, participation in ethics consultations, or even their ability to access these services or be an active participant in ethical dialogue at the point of decision-making has been curtailed or prohibited. Nurses need to have the courage to stand up for themselves and their patients when these kind of situations arise and advocate for their inclusion as a moral agent in the care of the patient for helping to resolve ethical dilemmas involving patient care. I also tell my nursing students that if they're interviewing for particular jobs and they can learn whether or not there is an ethics consultation service or ethics committee and whether nurses are welcome to serve on these organizations, that is a very good litmus test to determine how ethics is going to be seen in the organizational context. If nurses are not going to be allowed to participate or don't access frequently these ethics services, this could be a key indication that the student nurse or the nurse considering switching jobs to this institution may find that the institution is very hostile to the nurses and don't support them and may not be a very good place to work.
What is clinical ethics and what isn't it?
This podcast aims to overcome any perception that ethics is seen as some sort of alien force outside of regular clinical practice, to be resisted and feared along with other bureaucratic forces that may impede the care of patients. Many listeners may remember that there was a backlash of bioethics that started in the 1970s, and this was a justified criticism that bioethics used abstract, overly academic approaches. And this backlash has continued to some extent, although we are trying to overcome this by having very clinically focused courses, including the one you're listening to and this whole series of podcasts that we are producing. Our goal is to suggest that ethics should be seen as a vital part of the clinical workup of a patient, and the clinician should be trained in how to do these things and should participate in continual professional education.
What is ethics?
Ethics is actually understood in a variety of different senses, and how we actually use the word makes a difference to the climate in which moral problem solving can be done effectively. For some, ethics refers only to those issues of their particular character. Believing that they are already, quote, ethical, that is, that they have good character, they can misunderstand and resist the work of ethics committees. This is really a misunderstanding of what we're trying to do in clinical ethics. Others link ethics to specific issues in the professional relationship between themselves, patients, and other clinicians, such as sexual behavior, having unfair fees or self-serving referrals. While typically these are seen under the rubric of ethics, ethics is a much more broad category to describe the moral issues that arise in clinical medicine, and we will talk about that next.
Ethics versus morality.
As I mentioned, how we use ethics and how we use the word morality can actually help us distinguish what exactly ethics is and what it isn't. Let's go back to the etymology of the word ethics in Greek and Latin. For the Greeks, the word ethos described one's character, and that's perhaps one of the reasons why we still have that artifact that most people think that ethics has to do with their character. Morality, on the other hand, goes back to the Latin word mores, which also means character, but can also be translated to mean custom or habit. Now, we typically understand morality to mean those things that are widely shared beliefs about the moral life and the norms of right and wrong conduct that prevail in our culture, whereas we typically think of ethics as having many different meanings. A proper philosophical use of the word ethics means systematic ethics, that is, the perspective from which we evaluate and live the moral life.
The difference between morality and ethics.
As I said, this is a very important distinction. A practical way to distinguish between morality and ethics is that we regard morality as normative or prescriptive. What this means is that morality helps us to define what we ought to do in this or similar situations. A bit different is what ethics is. Ethics is systematic and to be regarded as justificatory, interpretive, and analytical. So rather than ask the question of what I ought to do in this and similar situations, ethics asks, why should I perform a particular action? Why should I do X? And what reasons would then justify such an action and why? We use a variety of different ethical theories to provide answers to this question. If you have listened to the podcasts, episodes 1 and 2, you will be aware of the three most common normative ethical theories there to help us with this.